Okay. So this time we're going to be discussing about fatty acid metabolism. Now, take note. Wait lang, hindi ko pa na-share yung screen ko. Wait lang. Okay. Does everybody are showing my screen now on their end?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay, so for today, we're discussing about fatty acid metabolism, the different pathways that are usually involved in terms of lipids and its other subfamilies. Now, the first thing we're going to do is discuss first about how lipids are being absorbed in the body, and then later on, we'll go to the different pathways. So, usually, when you talk about digestion, remember the three basic food groups that we have. We have proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Now, remember the different organ system, particularly inside the digestive system. We have the oral cavity, the mouth, the tongue, uh, the salivary glands that usually helps in the digestion, for particularly the preliminary part. And then you also have your stomach in the small intestines. Now, comparing carbohydrates and lipids and proteins, carbohydrates already started with the digestion in the mouth. Remember, we have amylase, wherein if you eat bread, it's actually starting to, it's almost half hydrolyzed na siya. Now, in comparison with lipids, however, in terms of lipids, you don't actually show the same thing. It's not the same thing that you're gonna have because what would happen with lipids is that it's not it does not have much action when it comes to mouth digestion or oral cavity digestion. It's you're gonna see digestion more on the area of the large small intestines particularly. So let's start off first with the digestion in the mouth. Okay, so we started off, of course, when you swallow food. For example, ano ba masarap na ulam ng tanghalian? Let's say sinigang, di ba? Yung sinigang contains your vegetables, your proteins, and your fat. Di ba masarap-sarap yung, for those who are eating sinigang, pork sinigang particularly, masarap-sarap konti yung, ano eh, yung fat kasi nga masyado ng pinakuluan ng matindi. Alam mo yun, parang nagme-melt na siya. Pero actually, wala masyadong action sa mouth kasi po, aside from the action of your teeth cutting the pieces all together, you also have the action of what we call the lingual lipase. We say lingual lipase, these are your lipases or enzyme that tends to break down lipids that are available inside your mouth area. Okay? Kaya nga lingual, no? Which means related to the tongue. Okay? Now, take note that in the sorry, let me just go back. Here, in the digestion in the mouth, minimal ang action. Kaya nga, if you're going to go into looking up to in terms of digestion, most of the resources are not showing digestion in the mouth kasi nga very minimal yung action ng mouth. And same as with the stomach, some books automatically go directly to the small intestine. Pero just to cite it, both sides, particularly the mouth and the stomach, both has lipases. Now, take note, for the oral cavity is lingual lipases, and pagdating naman sa stomach, you have what we call the gastric lipase, okay? So, it also has, the lingual lipase is still active, pero yun nga lang, the action is not that good kasi nga minor lang yung action niya, same as with the gastric lipase. Okay? Now, usually, the only time that you're gonna see action is when it enters the small intestine. So, usually, it's already smaller dahil nandun sa action ng churning, ng stomach. And then we also have one component that is very, very important, which is bile. Now, bile is not present in the previous parts that I mentioned. It's only present in the small intestine. And take note that it is created in the liver and it is stored in the gallbladder. So every time there is a amount of fat that is being digested, it is being released by the gallbladder into the small intestine. Okay, so this actually allows to break down fast into smaller parts. So if you recall your chemistry, di ba, when you talk about, di ba pag nagagawa, kahit na sa paggagawa na natin ng juice, di ba, alin ang makabilis na makapagpalamig ng inumin? Is it the tube ice or yung crush ice? Di ba pag nakikita ninyo, yung crush ice, mas madali siyang matunaw, pero mas mabilis siyang mapapalamig yung component kasi mas maraming surface area na involved. Same as with ano din, pag gumagawa kayo ng, let's say, yung gumawa kayo ng malalaking sugar. If you use fine sugar, mas mabilis tumamis yung tinitimpla ninyo. But if you use coarse sugar like buscopado, ano pa ba? Um, brown sugar, it will take time. Hahaluin pa siya maigi bago siya ma-expose lahat yung areas for mixing. Okay? Now, inside the bile, we also have bile salts that actually can interact both with fats and water. So, both polar and non-polar. Okay, and that is the reason why we are able to absorb fat. Take note that it is hydrophobic, okay, or it's a non-polar material. Now, inside the bag, you can find there, it's actually made up of micelles, of lecithin. Micelles is actually the compactualization or compartmentalization of lecithin. So, usually, yung mga, pag kunyari, tumitingin kayo sa mga nilaga na may konting taba or may konting fat, makikita nyo, di ba yung mga nagbibilog-bilog sa ibabaw? That is an example of a micelle. Okay? So, usually, they bind together to form now and to form your compound. And then at the same time, it also gives the color. Now, sorry, pasintabi sa mga kumakain dyan, ha? Usually, guys, this is also the reason why our poop has its particular color. And usually, in terms of poop, this actually tells you how healthy you are. So, if it is brown, medyo maganda ang digestion mo. Pag kulay green, guys, nagmamadali ang paglabas nun. Hindi na breakdown yung mismong, masyado pang marami yung bile sa katawan, sa ilalabas mo. Kumbaga, mabilis dumadaan yung food sa tiyan mo. Okay, usually you see that if for those who are having digestive problems. Okay, so yeah, and then at the same time, this is actually an effective emulsifier. So this is the main function of bile, is to emulsify. So you break it down into smaller droplets. Okay, parang ano kayo, nag-crush, kinrush ninyo yung taba into very very small parts. Okay, so that's what happened inside the small intestine. Now, so the action wherein the lipase is the bile is able to make it accessible for the interaction of the enzymes is called emulsification. Now, aside from bile, we have also another one. It's the pancreatic lipase. Diba? Tatlo na yung klase ng lipase na dinention natin. Lingual, gastric, and then the pancreatic. Ito ngayon yung nilalabas natin sa small intestine. And this is the one that is able now to further break down your lipids into smaller components. So triglycerides are actually broken down into fatty acids and monoglycerides. Okay, so you have a glycerol and one fatty acids and some free glycerol. So once you already have this, they can now be easily enter the system, which we will be discussing later on. Now, take note, yung mga vitamins, hindi siya nababreakdown ng enzymes. Okay? Kaya nga, okay lang yung vitamins eh. Na-absorb niyan talaga sa katawan. Okay? Now, the products of digestion, like fatty acids, yung mention natin, yung mga na-breakdown at mga hindi na-breakdown, papasok ngayon yan into circulation. And how it enters it is actually by forming now clusters with the action of bile. So mag-aggregate sila, which will form now the micelle, and this will actually be able to allow them to move inside. Kung wala po yung bile at hindi sila nakapag-form ng micelle, kasi remember when you say micelle, it also includes other proteins and other molecules that would allow it to adhere or to pass through the microvilli, which is found in our small intestines. Otherwise, it's not going to be absorbed. Nandiyan lang yung mantika sa labas ng small intestine. Okay? Now, once inside, They diffuse to the membrane, to the intestinal cells, and then at the same time, it actually breaks it down, and then it brings it back to its original form. Okay? When you say it brings it back to its original form, it goes back. Di ba kanina sinabi natin that your uh, triglyceride becomes monosaccharide, ay, it's not monoglycerides. Triglycerides become monoglycerides and fatty acids. Paglampas nila sa intestinal walls, balik ulit sila sa triglycerides. Now, cholesterol is also included in the micelle, and that's how cholesterol is also being absorbed in the body. Example of that, yung mga bacon, yung fat ng bacon contains cholesterol. You also have yung sa corned beef, may cholesterol din yan. Okay? Remember yung sa mismong yung sa sebo mismo ng baka, yan. Napakatapang yan. Okay? Now, next slide. So once it's inside the intestinal wall, yun yung sinabi ko sa inyo, it is now gonna be forming back the triglycerides, and then it's gonna be absorbed in the blood streams, particularly yung medium chain and glycerol. But yung mga long chain and monoglycerides and fat-soluble vitamins and cholesterol, it will now be entering the bloodstream also. Okay? So, yung mga maliliit, dumidiretso. Yung mga malalaki, they have to combine together. Okay? So, again, ito yung part na yung sinasabi sa inyo that they need to form the triglycerides and form now what we call the chylomicron. Okay? So, the chylomicron is actually a combination of fat-soluble vitamins, long-chain fatty acid, monoglycerides, and cholesterol. Okay, so here in this diagram, this is actually showing the different action of digestion. So here you have here your fat. With the action of bile, it's going to be chopped down into smaller parts. Okay, and this is still in the intestine, small intestine. Now, once it's already in the small intestine, you are now, for example, for the action of the triglyceride, it's broken down into the monoglycerides and fatty acids, and then it's now going to be working with the chylomicron here. Okay, so here's what's happening. So once it enters the proteins, the small intestine, you have the reaction of the chylomicron with the help of the Golgi apparatus. So it's packaged now to shift inside the blood vessels. Okay? So yan. So pag short and medium, diretso sa blood vessel. And then yung long chain, mag-form pa lang sila ng chylomicrons before it enters. Okay? So hindi nakita dito yung mga small eh. Pinakita lang dito is yung mga complex. Okay? So this is actually this complex. Okay, and some of it also enters the lymphatic system. Okay, so any questions so far with lipid lipid degradation, or not exactly lipid with degradation, or what we call lipid absorption so far, guys? Question? Okay, I guess none. So let's move on to fatty acid degradation. So yung fatty acid degradation, before we go proceed to the actual process itself, let's go into discussing what was the background. How were they able to isolate the structure? So it was actually Franz Knupp who made labeling. Kasi yung mga panahon na ginagawa to, usong-uso na mo yung radioactive tracers. This was actually the time that the DNA was also identified, yung Krebs cycle. So everybody was looking into the different parts of metabolism. So what Noops did was he actually fed his dogs with labeled radioactive fatty acids, okay? And he was able to identify that for even number hydrocarbons, fatty acids, you will actually be forming now phenyl acetate and acetate. And for odd numbers, you will be getting benzoate and acetate. So they were able to see that there are a lot of acetates that are being produced when you have the metabolism of fatty acids. Okay. although there were a lot of other studies related to it, but um, the one that was identified by Franz Lug was actually parang siya yung nag-stem ng lahat ng study when it comes to fatty acid degradation. Okay? So here we also call it as beta oxidation. So usually we say fatty acid oxidation. This is actually a mitochondrial aerobic process. So take note, it's happening inside the mitochondria, and you break down fatty acid into acetyl coenzyme A units. So fatty acids move into the pathway utilizing NAD and FAD, and at the same time, it's activated before oxidation utilizing ATP in the presence of coenzyme thiol and coenzyme A synthetase. Now, take note that long chain acyl coenzyme A enters mitochondria bound to carnitine. So, ito yung carnitine shuffle. Now, inside the mitochondria, beta oxidation of fatty acid takes place in which two carbon atoms are removed in the form of acetyl-CoA from acyl-CoA at the carboxyl terminal. Now, this is actually the reason why it's called a beta oxidation, because it is happening between the second carbon, which is the beta carbon, and the third carbon, which is the gamma carbon. Kaya nga beta oxidation siya. Okay, so let's go now to the different steps in beta oxidation. So, the first one, okay, is the activation step. Wait lang guys, wait lang. I-plastic mo na lang yan, i-fold mo, may buto. I-plastic mo na lang kasi magaan mo. Anong plastic? Black? Yun, 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 yun. Isa tapat mo, harap ng mukha mo. Hindi, gilid. Yan. Huwag mo muna sabit mo lang. Okay, sorry, going back. So the first step is the activation. So what would happen is that a thioester bond is formed between acyl coenzyme A rather, and the fatty acid. Okay, so the reaction requires the form of ATP, and then coenzyme A is required for this step. So you'll actually be adding a coenzyme A to your fatty acid. Okay, now take note that this is actually uh, located in the outer membrane of the mitochondria. Okay. Now, for the first step, guys, ito yung medyo a little bit complicated kasi meron tayong tinatawag yung carnitine shuttle na tinatawag kasi it has to move from one part of the system to the next kasi hindi siya makakapasok inside. Okay? Mitochondria only accepts, it does not accept a coenzyme A compound inside. It can accept a coenzyme A per se, but a fatty acid coenzyme A, hindi niya pinapapasok yon. So, what would happen is, so coenzyme A na siya, maghihiwalay ulit sa, okay, by L-carnitine. Remember, I think it was Dole yung nagtitinda ng L-carnitine na inumin. And although you can actually get it from meaty products or meat products, but this is actually the one that helps the coenzyme to pass through the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, so yun yung tinatawag nila na carnitine shuttle. So what would happen here? So fatty acid coenzyme na siya, di ba? Pero bago siya makapasok, papalitan siya, gagawin siyang uh, acyl carnitine, iibahin yung compound para siya makapasok. Okay? So here, this is what's happening. So so gagawin mo na siyang acyl carnitine para makapasok yung fat, and then acyl, then afterwards, saka ngayon siya makakapass through dun sa membrane ng mitochondria. Okay, so this is what you have actually two. You have carnitine acyltransferase 1 and acyltransferase 2 in this process. Okay? So yeah, so pag nakalusot na siya doon sa mitochondrial matrix, that's the time they will go back to fatty acid coenzyme A. Now, once na nakapasok na doon, saka na ngayon mag-start yung mismong beta oxidation. So usually this is a series of repetition of steps 3, 2 to 5. Okay? So let's start with this reaction 2 or step 2. So in step 2, it will have undergone an oxidation of FAD to produce of your fatty acid coenzyme A and reduce FAD to form FADH2. Okay? So this is actually with the help of enzyme acyl coenzyme A. So what would happen is that so ito yung first carbon mo, ito yung alpha, ito yung beta, and this is your gamma. Okay? So what would happen is that by oxidizing it, this compound, you're actually removing two hydrogen from the beta and the gamma, giving it away to FADH2. So what you'll have is a double bond here. Okay? Now, on the third step, you're going to add water into the system. Now, this is actually following what we call in organic chemistry Markovnikov's rule. Markovnikov's is actually a rule stating that when you combine a compound that contains hydrogen or can release hydrogen into the system, yung unang-unang hydrogen or yung hydrogen per se will be attaching itself near to the terminal. So this is the terminal part. Hindi po kasama to kasi po it is part of the CoA. Okay, so ito lang within beta and gamma po. So since this beta is near the end or the terminal, so the hydrogen will attach itself on the beta and then giving us H2, and then the hydroxide will attach itself with the gamma, giving it a hydroxide. Okay, so that's what's happened. So this is hydration. Now the fourth step, you're going to be having reducing NAD to NADH by taking away the hydrogen from the hydroxide in the gamma carbon, making it a carbonyl. Okay, and this is what's with the help of enzyme um, L-beta hydroxyl coenzyme A dehydrogenase. Okay, and then the last one, this is the time we're gonna be adding a coenzyme A. The coenzyme A will be attaching itself with the gamma, and then this one will cleave off the uh, beta. Puputulin siya dyan. So you'll be having now one acetyl coenzyme A. Okay? Now take note that the shortened fatty acyl coenzyme A is further oxidized by cycling to reactions 2 to 5. Okay? So paulit-ulit yon hanggang maubos siya. And acetyl coenzyme A is produced by the beta oxidation of fatty acid. And then it enters now the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. So this is actually what it looks like. Pasensya na medyo may audio siya kasi ni-record ko lang to ng screen. The website where this originally came from is no longer available because they no longer support Flash programs. Okay? So yeah, let me just, yeah. Okay, so you have here a fatty acid. Fatty acid, this is palmitate. So you have there step 2, FAD. Yan. So nag-double bond siya doon, producing FADH2. Hydration, addition of water. Hydrogen here, hydroxide here. Then step 4, tagal ni step 4, si NAD. Okay, so it's actually gonna remove now the hydrogen from this one, causing it to form now the double bond. Okay, corb force carbonyl. So tanggal yung isang hydrogen doon. And then step 5, you have now your coenzyme A. Yan. So it's actually gonna go here. Here. Yan. Okay, this now becomes a new set of alpha and beta based on the positions. Okay, so paulit-ulit lang siya hanggang maubos niyo yan. Okay, so as you notice here, medyo slowly bumibilis na siya as it's showing the same cycle over and over again. Okay, so step 3, hydration. Step 4, reduction of NADH to form NADH and hydrogen and CoA. Step 5. Yan. So, mas mabilis na siya hanggang sa maubos na ngayon siya. Now, take note, all the acetyl coenzyme A is now available for Krebs cycle. And since these are all undergoing or happening inside the mitochondria, it's all going to enter the electron transport chain. So this is the fifth cycle or the fifth time. Okay, so actually there is six turns from step 2 to 5 or six times that steps 2 to 5 happen. And we have now your set products. Okay, so yan. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. That is actually the speed up session for the fatty acid degradation. Now, things to remember here that if you're talking about even uh, fatty acids, all of them will be producing acetyl coenzyme A, which is a two carbon compound. Okay, and all of them will be available for TCA cycle. However, if you're having naman odd number of acyl coenzyme A chain or odd numbered fatty acids, it will still continue, but you're not gonna have all as acetyl coenzyme A. You will end up having three carbon propionyl coenzyme A, and the rest are acetyl coenzyme A. Syempre, pag add, so isa magiging tatlo, the rest are twos. Now, here is the overall reaction. So, you have N-acyl coenzyme A plus FAD, NAD ion, water, and coenzyme A will give you C and minus 2, acyl coenzyme A, FADH2, NADH, hydrogen ion, and acetyl coenzyme A. Okay? So, yan po yung sa beta oxidation. Now, if you're going to compute the overall amount of your palmitate, so you have palmitic acid, it will have to undergo change it into a palmityl coenzyme A. This the first step, you need to consume ATP. Okay, so gagamit ka ng ATP in the process. And then, once it's already in the coenzyme A, it will be entering your beta oxidation. Now, since it is this is 16 carbon, so it's an even, it produces 7 FADH, 7 NADH, and 8 units of acetyl coenzyme A. Now, since it went through electron transport chain, use 7 FADH became 14 through low energy electron transport chain, while NADH produce high energy, so it's times 3. Okay? And the rest of the 8 acetyl coenzyme A entered TCA cycle or citric acid cycle. Since 8 times siya na umikot, so 8 produces tatlong NADH times 8 will give you 72 Tapos FADH niya is isa lang, pero times 8, you get 16 ang napoproduce. And then ATP, since it produces 1 GTP per cycle times 8, you get 8 ATP. So pag tinotal mo lahat-lahat yan, you get a 131 ATP molecules. But since you utilize ATP at the start of the process, ang net ATP mo is 129 lamang. Okay? So that is for beta oxidation. Any questions so far, guys? Questions, clarifications, violent reactions? None so far? Camille? Thank you, Leonard. So let's continue. Okay, so the next one is ketone bodies. Okay, now for ketone bodies, usually this is as we discussed earlier, acetyl coenzyme is produced by beta oxidation of fatty acids so that it will enter the TCA cycle. Yun nga lang, uh, meron dapat na adequate supply of oxaloacetate. Now, if in case glycolysis and beta oxidation are occurring the same rate, merong steady supply of pyruvate from glycolysis that can be converted to oxaloacetate. However, if the supply of oxaloacetate is too low to allow acetyl coenzyme A to enter TCA cycle, what would do is to convert it into what we call the ketone bodies. Okay? So yung mga nakakarinig ng mga ketone, ketone diet, yan, ito po yon. Okay? So here are the three examples or ketone bodies that are being produced by the body. You have beta hydroxybutyrate, acetone, and acetoacetate. Okay, so yan yung tatlong napoproduce. Okay, so let's talk about some facts about ketone bodies. So you have what we call the uh, ketosis, which is it is a metabolic state characterized by high levels of ketones inside the body. Now, it's further defined as a physiologic ketosis. So, usually this is happening when you have low glucose availability, such as low carb diet. Ito yung gusto mangyari ng ketone diet. So, hindi ka masyadong kakain ng mga carbohydrates like starchy foods. Bawal po yan. And ang kakainin mo lang is high protein and high fat diet. Okay? So, ang magiging source tuloy ng energy ng brain is ketos. Yun nga lang may konting ano siya, based on doon sa kakilala ko na nag-undergo ng keto diet is medyo, alam mo yun, kinainom ng tubig, which is one of the side effects of having ketosis sa katawan. Okay? Yan. Although you have high levels of ketones in the blood, yun nga lang, yung acid level ng katawan mo hindi pa ganun kadelikado. Okay? Next is ketogenesis. So ketogenesis is the pathway of metabolism wherein fatty acids and amino acids are broken down to provide the alternative energy source, which is ketones. So our body produces ketone bodies in low amounts, but in certain cases like starving, when carbohydrates are present in less amount in diet, ketogenesis is preferred to compensate for the energy requirements. Okay? So ketogenesis occurs continuously in healthy individual, but under certain conditions when there is an increased concentration of fatty acids or carbohydrate reserves are decreased. Ketogenesis happens at a higher rate. So, ito yung mga situations. Unang-una, if you are undergoing fasting. So, when you say fast, wala masyadong food or walang masyadong carbohydrates kang kinukonsume. Pangalawa, if you're having exhaustion of carbohydrate reserves, talagang as in wala kang intake. So, usually, if I'm not mistaken, based on what my friend told me, mga 6 days siya. Yun ang tina-target niya, 6 continuous days na walang carbohydrate para ma-trigger yung ketosis. Okay? And then there is insufficient insulin, particularly for those who have type 1 diabetes. Now, all the main parts of the body, such as brain, skeletal muscle, heart, can utilize energy formed from ketogenesis. Okay? So, alternative ng mga yan. Kaya minsan kahit gutom tayo, diba, although may mararamdaman nyo yung konting tremors, but later on, you can still work. Pero alam mo yon yung nag-ano ka na, marami ka na nararamdaman sa katawan mo pag hindi ka na kumakain na on time. Okay, and insufficient gluconeogenesis results in hypoglycemia and excessive production of ketones, which can result in a fatal condition called ketoacidosis. So medyo mataas na yun at delikado na pag ketoacidosis. So usually we say although I'm not sure kung parang wala yata sa report yun ng group 3, pero definitely you're gonna have a high level of acid. Pati yung hininga mo, it's gonna change, have a different distinctive smell. Okay? Acetone breath ang tawag to. Later, we'll talk about those characteristics. Okay, so let's go to the different ketogenesis steps. So unang-una po, so you have there, take note pala that this is happening in the mitochondria of living cells. Okay, so we have actually 1, 2, 3, 4, excuse me, 4 steps in ketogenesis. So unang-unang step is the condensation of 2-acetyl coenzyme A to form now acetoacetyl coenzyme A, okay, with the enzyme thiolase. Okay? So yun yung pagbuo lang nilang dalawa. Then the second one, so this is actually produces beta hydroxy methyl glutaryl coenzyme A from acetic coenzyme A using HMG-CoA synthase. Okay? So HMG-CoA synthase is actually beta hydroxy beta metaglutaryl CoA synthase. Okay? So it's gonna be adding another uh, carbon or another coenzyme A, tama ba? Wait lang. It's actually gonna add another OH into the system. Okay, so particularly on one, two, three, four, on the fourth carbon. So it's added hydroxide into the system. Next one, the third step is you're going to break it down. Okay, so you're going to remove one acetyl coenzyme in the system, producing back acetoacetate, and then your acetoacetate now can be utilized to form acetone or d-beta hydroxybutyrate. Okay, so yan po. So this is actually the final step in ketogenesis. Now, why is it important to have ketogenesis? So, it is, as I mentioned, this is an alternative way to get energy for the important organs, skeletal muscle, heart, and brain under fasting condition. Kaya nga di ba yung iba, um, pag nagpa-fasting, they're still alive. Kahit yung iba yung nag-hunger strike, yan. Yun nga lang, minomonitor nila kasi baka mag-ketosis nga, delikado. Then, ketogenic diet, ito yung sinasabi ko, is used to lose weight. The idea is to utilize excess fat stored in the body to get energy, but excess ketone bodies produced can lead to various complications and ketoacidosis. And in ketoacidosis condition, the kidneys secrete extra ketone with the water, resulting in fluid loss. Now, sometimes, sinasabi nila, pag sinabi mo kasi na nakiketoacidosis ka, yung ihi ka ng ihi. Okay? Kasi nga meron kang nilalabas ng ketone doon. Okay? And then, diabetic patients are greatly affected by ketoacidosis because insulin hormone is the main regulator of the process. Now, more on significant symptoms of ketoacidosis include ito. Frequent urination, yung hininga, amoy prutas o medyo amoy acetone. Ito, nausea, yun ay hilo na susuka, shortness of breath, fatigue, and excess thirst. Okay? And then level of ketone bodies present in the body can be tested yung using blood test, your common blood serum test or yung mga complete blood test. Hindi pwedeng CBC. CBC po ang tinitingnan nyo lang doon is yung yung components. Pero in terms of other materials, you do complete blood test. And then sa urine po, natetest din po yung ketone sa urine. Okay? So, yan. Now, let's now go to fatty acid biosynthesis. Now, fatty acid biosynthesis is usually the combination of eight two carbon fragments. So, you're actually going to aggregate to form now your palmitate. So, walong piraso na paulit-ulit, you're going to add your two carbon fragments to form the palmitate. Now, palmitate can be modified to give rise to other fatty acids, and it can produce either elongation from 16 to 18 carbons, desaturation to produce unsaturated fatty acids. Okay, so ito yung pwedeng nangyari for palmitate. So the compound or the formula for fatty acid biosynthesis, you need your acetyl coenzyme A. You have 7 malonyl coenzyme A, 7 times na i-add to into the system. And then 4 NADPH and 4 hydrogen ions to produce to you palmitic acid plus carbon dioxide, 8 CoA, and 14 NADP and water. Okay? So yeah, let's go now to the biosynthesis. So this is actually occurring inside the cytoplasm of the liver, adipose tissue, central nervous system, and inside the mammary gland. Okay? And at the same time, we also fatty acid biosynthesis is actually characterized or can be classified or named differently based on the location. So if it is happening inside the uh, liver, okay, it's called as lipogenesis. Now, if it is happening inside the cytosol, ang tawag sa kanya is de novo synthesis of fatty acid. Okay? Now, take note that they need a particular compound which is fatty acid synthase complex. Okay? Now, in some books, if you're going to read this up, you will see that kino-compare nila yung fatty acid degradation and biosynthesis. Kinompare nila. Later on, we'll show that as well. Okay? So, this is actually the creation of fatty acids from acetyl-CoA, NADPH through the process called, through the enzyme called fatty acid synthase. Okay? Now, in terms of location, this is happening inside the cytosol, and this is carried out by FAS. Okay, so I mentioned this already. Okay. So yeah. So before we start with the fatty acid synthesis, so take note that as mentioned earlier, you need to have acetyl coenzyme A. So your acetyl coenzyme A are usually coming from glycolysis when you change glucose into pyruvate, and then it enters now the mitochondria. Okay, and then it's further divided to form before it enters the Krebs cycle to form oxaloacetate and then citrate. Okay, so usually ATP inhibits citric acid enzyme so that acetyl coenzyme A can be used in fatty acid synthesis pathways. Okay, now eto ngayon yung tinatawag natin na citrate shuttle. Okay, so the citrate shuttle transports acetyl coenzyme A out of the mitochondria by combining it with oxaloacetate to form citrate. And then once it's already in the citrate, saka lang siya makakalabas. Kasi yung oxaloacetate, it cannot pass through the membrane barrier. Okay? So once it's outside, babalik siya ngayon to form now your acetyl coenzyme A and oxaloacetate. Okay? Then papasok ulit siya to form now your uh, fatty acid synthesis. So let's go to the steps. Now, this time guys, hindi ko na siya pinakita yung picture kasi po I made it a little bit simple in terms of showing you the steps. So unang-una is that acetyl coenzyme A is converted to malonyl CoA via acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase. Now, malonyl CoA is transferred to FAS, and usually in the FAS, it will undergo the series of repetition of condensation, reduction, dehydration reaction. So the two carbons of malonyl CoA are added to the fatty acid, yung po pahaba na pahaba. Okay, so padagdag ng padagdag yung malonyl CoA doon, dinadala niya ng dinadala ng acyl group. Okay. Now, fatty acids are then recharged with another malonyl moiety and the cycle continues. Now, each turn of the cycle results in the additional of 2 carbon into the fatty acid moiety as well as the use of 1 ATP, 1 acetyl coenzyme A, and 2 NADPH. Okay. Now, when the cycle is completed, 7 turns, you have now your 16 carbon acid palmitate which is released from FAS. Okay. So, ito po yung actual na ano niya, pathway niya. So ito yung kanina, introduction of malonyl-CoA, acetyl with acetyl coenzyme A, carboxylase, inad siya to form malonyl, and then tinanggal yung CoASH, forming malonyl ACP. And then pag naging malonyl ACP na siya guys, acyl carrier protein, it's actually now, ito na, nakatouch na to. This part of the cycle is already part of the FAS. Okay, so ito po yung cycle na paulit-ulit hanggang sa makabuo ka ng palmitate. So 7 times to mag-uulit dito. Okay, so add lang kayo ng add ng dalawa. Okay? Now, ano yung pinagkaiba ng fatty acid synthesis and degradation? So, usually there is comparison on that one. So, unang-una, location. So, take note that the enzymes for fatty acid biosynthesis are located in the cytoplasm, while as beta oxidation is in the mitochondria. Now, sa acyl carrier group, yung mismong uh, biosynthesis, meron siyang acyl carrier protein, yung fatty acyl carrier protein. While in beta oxidation, ang meron lang po is coenzyme A. Okay? Yun nga lang, ang pagkakaiba nila is that iisa lang din yung vitamin, which is pantothenic acid. Okay, so pantothenic acid is important in terms of metabolism lipids, both for building up and breaking it down. Okay, ano bang pinagkaiba nila? So if you will notice here, ito po yon. Ito po yung nagdadagdag or nagdadala ng acyl group. So ito po yung ACP. Now this time, this is naman for acetyl coenzyme A. Okay, so ito yung pinagkaibahan nila. So almost the same sila, ito lang po ang pinagkaiba. Okay? Now, another thing to remember about the difference in that one, yung enzyme, you sa biosynthesis, you have your complex multi-enzyme, which is fatty acid synthase, while for beta oxidation, wala po na multi-complex. And then for electron carriers, okay, so for beta oxidation, you produce NADH and FADH2. For biosynthesis, you produce NADPH. Now, take note that the difference between NADP and NADPH is actually just the presence of phosphate. Okay, so ito po yung itsura niya. Okay, so ito po yung buong NADH. And then pag dinagdag mo to, ito na po yan. NADPH na siya. Parang si Superman. Tanggalin mo yung salamin, siya na yun. Okay? Yan. Now, before we go to regulation of metabolism, of lipid metabolism, let me just go through cholesterol synthesis. Okay. Now, this is actually coming from Thomas Day Spring, which is a fellow for an American doctor. Okay. So, on his presentation here, this is not my presentation, kinopya ko lang sa kanya. This is actually showing that the two persons who were responsible for cholesterol synthesis were actually Conrad Bloch and Fyodor Lenin. Okay? So take note that according to him, sterols are waxy insoluble substances or lipids synthesized from acetyl coenzyme A, and they are steroid-based alcohols having hydrocarbon, which is aliphatic, so straight chain siya. They are of 8 to 10 carbons at the position 17, and have hydroxyl group. Ito yung hydroxyl group here, sorry. And 3 position, making it an alcohol. So because of the hydrophilicity at the hydroxide and hydrophobicity in this part, it can actually both interact with uh, lipids, fats, and polar and nonpolar substances. Okay, and that is also why it can also be found in the cytoplasm. Okay, so there are actually 4 stages in cholesterol biosynthesis. Now, take note that it is happening inside the liver, and then some of the process is extrahepatic. Later on in the video, it will explain further what is extrahepatic. So, parang nasa paulit-ulit yung cycle niya outside the liver, if I'm not mistaken. Now, so it is actually a 4-step process wherein acetate is converted to mevalonate, to isoprene, then squalene. Now, squalene is actually the one responsible for sharks floating. Okay, this is actually a good if you want to maintain skin quality. Yeah, squalene. Okay, and then it forms now your cholesterol. So let's go to the different steps. Okay, so the first one is the you have your acetyl coenzyme. Now, if you will notice here, this is almost similar to fatty acid synthesis, right? I sorry, uh, to the one that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. Okay, so to the one that I mentioned earlier, which is in the fatty acid. Yun nga lang, there is a some sort of a regulation there, which we'll go through later on. Okay? So yan. So your first step is to form acetoacetyl coenzyme A using the same enzyme thiolase. Now, although this is it's still showing almost the same part of ketogenesis. Okay, so di ba acetyl coenzyme A to form beta hydroxy methyl butyryl coenzyme A. Okay. Yun nga lang, pagdating doon, it forms now mevalonate. Okay, so this is actually the part wherein it did not push through to form your ketone bodies. Okay, so the difference is that the enzyme is actually being regulated. Okay, so it's actually being regulated by steroid regulatory element binding protein. Okay, so this is the one responsible if it's going to proceed with ketone production or cholesterol. Okay, and then later on you have your mevalonate is phosphorylated from ATP to isoprene units or isoprenoids, which is then isomerized and converted to dimethyl allyl pyrophosphate. So yeah, okay. So you have your mevalonate, phosphomevalonate, mevalonate to form now your 3-phospho-pyrophosmevalonate. Ano ba yan? And then, if you will notice, although nag-phosphorylate siya on the fifth carbon, yung mismong yon actually change into a double bond. Okay, to form now your dimethyl allyl pyrophosphate. Okay, and here, once it's already formed on the third stage, your isoprenoids react with other to form now geranyl pyrophosphate. So ito na yung magko-combine sila to form now your squalene. Okay, so condensation sila actually. Okay, so from your isopentyl pyrophosphate, yung dimethyl allyl pyrophosphate, magiging geranyl, farnesyl, and then it will now form your squalene. Okay? So ito. Okay? Actually, back then guys, naging intong squalene kasi maganda siya para sa maintenance ng balat. You drink it. Lasa siyang fish oil kasi siya eh. Okay, usually naman guys, if it's oil, it's good for the elasticity ng mga balat. Yung mga nagda-dry, yan po yan. Okay? And then later on, the last stage for this one is the conversion of your squalene to form now your squalene 2,3-epoxide and then lanosterol and then cholesterol. Although your squalene 2,3-epoxide can form now also stigmaterol and then ergosterol. Okay, so this is actually by precursors of other compounds. But definitely, once from squalene, it will now cycle out. When you say cycle, magko-close na yung chain. Ayan. Ayan o, nagkakaroon na sila ng closing of the cyclic chain to form now your cholesterol here. Okay? So, if we remove the diagram of the compounds, ito po yung kanyang overall. Medyo mataas lang siya guys, dapat ito na sa baba. Kasi nung in-expand ko, medyo tumaas siya, pero dapat sa baba yan. Okay? So yan. So you have acetoacetyl coenzyme A forming HMG-CoA, mevalonate to form now your dimethyl allyl PP, isopentyl pyrophosphate, farnesyl pyrophosphate to form now your uh, squalene, which will become lanosterol, and then to form your cholesterol. Okay. Now our cholesterol is actually can form steroids, bile acids, and vitamin D. And at the same time, it's actually precursor of other materials as well, like vitamin A, particularly yung alpha-3 isopentyl pyrophosphate, which is the precursor for cholesterol. Yan yung pwede niyang gawin. So, if you will notice, medyo magkakahawig yung mga structures nila. Vitamin A, vitamin K, vitamin K. Yung carotenoids is almost similar with vitamin A kasi nga po, it's beta-carotene. It's also component, yung mismong structure niya is similar with vitamin A. And then you can also form rubber, phytochain in chlorophyll, dolichols, quinone, electron carriers. This is part of the electron transport chain. And then isoprene. Okay? Then you have also plant hormone of citric acid and gibberellic acid. Now, take note for isoprene, particularly, or isoprenoids, these are a class of largely hydrophobic or nonpolar compounds related being constructed biosynthetically from 5 carbon units. Actually, ito po yung mismong ano niya, one of the major products yan. Okay, so that is for cholesterol. Okay, so the last one is more on regulation of lipid metabolism. Okay. Now, in the discussion of the regulation of lipid metabolism, we're actually going to be going through different types of organs, how they metabolize fatty acids in terms of physiological importance. So, unang-una muna natin is we're going to be talking about glucose. Now, we all know that glucose is the one responsible in controlling the supply of liver pala, is the one responsible in controlling the supply of glucose in our body. Okay, so it actually converts glucose and converts it to glycogen or glycogen to glucose. And it can also produce glucose from other material like from lactate and overuse muscles. Okay, that's actually part of Cori cycle, which we'll talk about later on. Now, aside from carbohydrates, it also can control lipid metabolism. Okay. So when there is a surplus of fuel, the liver produces fatty acid, which is used to create triglycerides. Okay. And it transforms fatty acid into ketone bodies during fasting or starvation. Now, because the liver lacks an enzyme that converts acetoacetate to acetyl coenzyme A, these ketone bodies cannot be used. As a result, the liver ketone bodies are transported in the organs where they will oxidize to produce ATP. Okay? So, yeah. So, ito po yung structure niyan. So, during meal, of course, you have a high supply of glucose in the body. And it's going to be converted back into glucose, down to glucose. And then, it will be due to glycolysis, it will form glucose 6 phosphate. Now, glucose 6 phosphate can produce your pyruvate, which will be used by the muscles as a fuel, or it can be used to store up glycogen. Okay? Or pwede din siyang gawing fatty acid synthesis. And then, of course, if you have already a large accumulation of fats, it will join up with VLDL, and it's going to be deposited all over the body as a form of an adipose tissue. Now, if in case sa gutom naman, you have your, or after um, during fasting. Okay? So yung mga na-store natin usually na adipose tissue, it will be broken down it will be brought back into the system, and then the fatty acids is broken down by the liver, and then for fuel, it will also convert glycogen to glycogen to glucose 6 phosphate, and then it will be used as glucose into the blood. Okay? So that's for the liver. Now, the other organ that we have is the adipose tissue. So remember, when you say adipose tissue, these are fatty acids that are stored inside the body into the forms of triglyceride. Okay, so ito yung type ng fat na na-create natin. So it's usually transported from the liver as VLDL complexes. So yan. Okay? And then adipose tissue is absorbed by the chylomicrons and fatty acids. Now, Usually, the glycerol 3 phosphate is required for the production of triglycerides in adipose tissue. To generate and store the glycerides adipose cells require a constant supply of glucose. So usually, it's the glucose that would help in the production of glycerol 3 phosphate before it becomes triglyceride. Okay? So once it forms triglycerides, pwede siya maging glycerol formation or pwede siyang maging a fatty acid. Okay? So both ways, it's still gonna be end up with the liver. Okay? Now, ito yung sa galing sa diet natin, for example, if you ate. Okay? Now, kung galing naman siya dun sa mga sobra, it will become as VLDL and it will form as fatty acid and with addition of fatty acid coenzyme A, and then it will change to triglycerides and then for deposition also. Okay? So take note that there will be no sufficient glycerol 3 phosphates for the resynthesis of triglycerides. Hindi na pag kulang po ito, hindi siya mag-synthesize. Okay? Uh, and then the fatty acids and glycerols are usually exported to the liver for further processing. So, ibabalik niya ulit kay liver yan. Okay? So, malaking trabaho talaga ni liver kaya ingatan natin si liver. Okay? Next is muscle tissue. Okay, so si muscle tissue, usually at rest, the energy is supplied by the beta oxidation of fatty acid. So, pag walang ginagawa. But every time it's working, flex din yung muscles niyan, the muscle obtains energy by the degradation of its own glycogen. So, meron usually tayong supply ng glycogen from the muscle tissue and it actually causes the buildup of lactate and from glycolysis. Okay? So, na-utilize natin siya. It becomes lactate now. Now, alternatively, it can use alanine in the process. So, alanine can be produced from protein degradation. Pag wala na po, pag naubos na lahat yung pyruvate. And aniline and lactate is gonna be shipped back into the liver for conversion to glucose. And then yung glucose, dadali na naman papunta dun sa muscles. Okay? So, yan po yung nagsusupply sa atin. Kaya minsan, di ba, parang pag gutom na gutom ka na, tapos patagal hindi ka nang makain ng sugar, wala ka masyadong carbohydrate sa katawan, parang hinang-hina yung mga muscles natin. Hinang-hina kang kumilos. Okay? Now, take note that heart muscle is the only one that prefers ketone bodies over glucose. So, yun ang kanyang energy source. Okay? Heart muscles. Now, another part is the brain. So, the brain, of course, uses glucose as the primary source, which is actually 60% for at rest ang ginagamit niya. Na pag ginutom mo yung sarili mo, syempre, nauubos ngayon yung glycogen natin. And the amount of glucose, if in case glycogen is down, also drops significantly. Now, the ketones can be used as an alternative. Kaya yung iba minsan, hindi sila hindi maganda yung kumakain ka ng maraming carbohydrates. Sana pag if you want to have your brain stimulated, you'd rather have oils and yung kaya pumasok yung mga mani-mani. Yan. Okay? So, pero hindi naman kailangan na yung grande yung kain mo, di ba? Okay? So, alternative niya is ketone bodies as a source. Now, fatty acids cannot cross the blood-brain barrier because of its characteristics. Hindi siya kasi makakapass through o hindi siya na-absorb ng blood. Okay? Kaya nga, di ba, pag kumakain ka ng puro taba, mamisaw, sakit ng batok ko, yan yun. That's because of the blood-brain barrier. Hindi pwede dumaan yung maraming, fatty acids yan. Pero, ketone bodies can enter the brain because of free carboxylate group that is found inside the system. Okay, so nagdi-dissolve siya sa blood or nag-adhere siya sa blood kaya it can enter the brain. Okay? So yan, that's actually what's happening for the brain. So mas prefer niya ang ketones or glucose, pero fats, no. Kaya high blood. Kaya yung iba term na nung mahilig kumain ng taba, putok-batok. Yan, yun yun. Okay? So this time, we're gonna be talking about insulin and glucagon in terms of cellular metabolism. So pang finale na talaga to. Okay? So, In let's talk first about insulin. So actually, insulin is produced in the beta cell of the islets of ang Langerhans. Ito yung isla na wala sa buong mundo. Nakikita niya sa loob ng katawan natin. It lowers the concentration of blood glucose by causing a number of changes in the metabolism by like stimulating storage of glucose such as glycogen and triglyceride. It also activates biosynthetic processes and inhibits catabolic process. Okay? Acts only on target cells. Ano ba yung mga target cells? The ones that are actually available in liver, adipose, and muscle cells. Okay? And then the blood glucose level is normally about 10 millimolar. However, a substantial meal increases the concentration of blood glucose considerably and stimulates insulin secretion. Pag mataas masyado yung sugar, lalabas si insulin. And subsequent binding of insulin to the plasma membrane, insulin receptor increases the rate of transport of glucose across the membrane into the cell. Okay? So yan po yung tatandaan natin pagdating sa insulin. So pag insulin, pag mataas ang sugar, insulin works. Kaya nga di ba yung mga diabetic dyan, usually it's either you take medications or insulin shot ka na para mas mabilis. Okay? Para makatulungan mo yung blood. Pero you can actually start naman din by lowering yung intake mo or you exercise. Kasi kaya nga naman nagkakaroon ng diabetes, mas masyadong mataas yung blood sugar and then yung amount ng intake mo, tapos wala masyadong activity. So definitely, it's gonna cause a problem in the system. Now, the other one, yung partner niya lagi is glucagon. So, this is actually secreted from the beta alpha cells. Okay, so yung insulin kanina galing sa beta, pero dito si glucagon is actually from the alpha cells ng islets of Langerhans. Okay? So, pag mababa na yung sugar, it will actually derive the sugar from the body. Okay, so opposite effect siya. So, it inhibits glycogen synthesis, stimulates glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, production of glucose. Okay? Breakdown ng glycogen. And it also stimulates the breakdown of fats and ketogenesis. Okay? Para mag-produce ng alternative source of energy. Okay? Now, here is a table showing the relationship of the different hormones in response to the different types of pathways. So, pag cellular glucose transport, walang effect si glucagon, si insulin lang. Okay? Pag mababa yung glucose level, mag-act siya. Mag-increase siya. Okay? Then glycogen synthesis, it is increasing and then decrease kay glucagon. Kasi nga po, pag glycogen synthesis, you're actually gonna be utilizing yung excess carbons or your excess carbohydrates. Okay? So, syempre, if you're going to produce or you're going to store yung carbohydrates mo via glycogen, it's the opposite of glucagon. Okay? Then glycogenolysis in liver, kabaligtaran naman. So it's decrease and then increase si glucagon. Okay? Kasi nga, kailangan mo ng sugar. Okay? Production niya ng sugar. Then gluconeogenesis, decrease pa rin siya, then increase. Okay? Then for proteins, guys, wala pong epekto, and lipogenesis, wala pong epekto siya kay glucagon. Okay? Kasi po, ito po, it's more on the production of carbohydrates. Okay? Lalo itong dalawa, this can actually be an alternative for carbohydrates, yung uptake ng amino acid, protein synthesis, while for amino acid release naman po, kasi pwede siya nga mag-fuel or an alternate, pero wala siyang epekto kay glucagon. Dito lang siya kay insulin. So pag amino uptake and protein synthesis, increase. Pag inhibition naman, decrease. Then lipogenesis is also increase, pero wala pong epekto kay glucagon. And the last two is for lipolysis and ketogenesis, decrease kay insulin, increase kay glucagon. Okay? So yan po. Any questions so far, guys, in terms of lipid metabolism? Any question, Miss Alcala? None?
Yan po.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Although I already have, let me just double check with your section. kung naano ko siya. Pero kasi in-upload ko na 'to, sige share ko lang 'to sa ano 'to, yan.
Our bodies are capable of surviving without food for long periods of time, up to 2 weeks.
Okay, this is for beta oxidation.
The reason we can do this is that we can store our dietary fuels and then break them down when we need them to make energy in the